Hi, everyone. So this is part two of our lecture on climate change. And if you remember, part one looked at the drivers of climate change, both the historic or natural drivers and the anthropogenic, which is our current drivers, right? Our emissions of greenhouse gases. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the impacts, both the current impacts and future impacts, as well as um, how we can mitigate those impacts or respond to future climate change. So, just to reiterate, the current warming that we are experiencing is due to greenhouse gas emissions from human sources, right? We talked about in the previous lecture, but you can see here post industrial revolution, which began worldwide at about 1850, there's been a huge increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and we've had a corresponding increase in global surface temperature, right? And this is leading to a number of climate and environmental effects that we're going to look at, right? So since 1900, the Earth has warmed approximately 1 degree Celsius, which doesn't seem like a lot. But then when we start looking at the effects, you're going to see that the great impact that even this 1 degree has had, right? If you look at our current climate effects, this is happening right now. We can see there are a number of them, and I'm going to try and go through them fairly quickly. But if we're talking about our current climate, we've seen that summer heat waves are increasing in severity and frequency. This means there's more dangerously hot days in the summer. There's an increased risk of forest fire, and there's an increased risk to human health, particularly in areas around the equator that are particularly hot, and in cities where there's the urban heat that adds to the extra heat experiencing by people. Precipitation patterns are changing. So we're seeing an increase in storm intensity and an increase in flooding. Some of that is due to sea level rise that we're going to look at. We're also seeing less rainfall, right? So we're seeing increased rainfall in some areas, but we're seeing less rainfall in other areas. But they're having more large rainfall events, right? So it's less spread out. So they're having more dry days and then few intense rainfall days, right? We're seeing that drought has expanded and deepened across the world. 95% of the western US is experiencing drought conditions right now. They're in a mega drought. It's been happening actually for 22 years. In Africa, droughts have increased about 30% since 1970, and extreme droughts in the Amazon rainforest associated with high temperatures have killed billions of trees. Our poles, or the regions near our poles, are actually warming faster or have warmed faster than the rest of the world. We said the global average is about 1 degree Celsius. At our poles, we're seeing average temperatures increase as much as 4 degrees Celsius over the past 50 years. That is leading to the melting of permafrost, which is the normally frozen ground, and as that melts, it becomes soft, and we're in cities in these areas or towns in these areas are having trouble with infrastructure being damaged, right, as the ground sinks. We're seeing a loss of Arctic sea ice. You can see it in those two images right there. About 13% per decade is the current rate. And Arctic sea ice is only half as thick now as it was 30 years ago. We've lost an area combined of about Texas and Oklahoma combined, 1 million kilometers square. We're also seeing a loss of ice mass from the Antarctic, right? So on the opposite pole. And this includes ice shelves, which are frozen ice on the ocean, as well as glaciers, which are ice on the land, right? Antarctica's ice shelves have lost 4 trillion metric tons, and you could see in the animations that are going since 1990. And 90% of glaciers are retreating in an average of 50 meters per year. And we've seen decline in penguin populations as a result of this. In Greenland, the ice cap is also melting twice as fast as it did a few years ago. This is current right now, and it's losing 279 billion metric tons of ice a year. Again, you can see that in those animations. Glaciers are disappearing worldwide, right? Not just in these areas, but around the world, glaciers are disappearing. At Glacier National Park in the US, in China, in Switzerland, on Mount Kilimanjaro, even, we're seeing the disappearance or the retreat of glaciers, right? You can see it pretty astoundingly here. This is Svalbard, where these photos have been taken. Now, this is kind of talking about the future a little bit, but we're going to get into it anyway. So it's expected that half the world's small glaciers will disappear by 2100. And this is important because in many areas, they depend on meltwater from glaciers for drinking and irrigation. So without that, they're losing their source of water. We're seeing sea level rise. Right? We've seen a mean sea level rise of 8 to 9 inches since 1880. And in New Jersey, it's double that. We've seen a sea level rise of about 18 inches, which is huge. Now, part of that reason is due to subsidence, right? So during the last ice age, glaciers moved down along the North American continent. Glaciers are very heavy, right? So when all that weight on the Earth or on the Earth's crust pushed down, and where those glaciers weren't or on the outskirts of them, it pushed the land correspondingly up, right? And what that happened at the Jersey Shore. So because of the weight of the glacier, it pushed up the land outside of that glacier. And now that that glacier has retreated, the land is starting to subside down again. We refer to this as subsidence. So what's happening in New Jersey, especially on the coast, is we are being impacted by subsidence, right, from that glacier retreating, and we are being impacted by this rising sea level, which is why we see such a huge effect here. And if you also see, if we're looking at the global sea level, again, it's the rate of it is increasing, right? This, if you look, you could see the rate is increasing as you get to recent years here. So right now we are averaging about 3.4 millimeters rise of sea level a year, which equates to about 1/10 of an inch, which may not seem like a lot, but in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, that is a big increase in sea level. Now we're seeing impacts to species right away, right now, currently. Climate change currently affects almost 11,000 species that are listed as threatened by the IUCN Red List. We've seen the first mammal, or we've documented the first mammal to go extinct as a direct result of climate change. That little guy right there, the Bramblecae mallomus. It was lost or it went extinct due to its habitat was destroyed by sea level rise. We're seeing coral reefs being destroyed. It's referred to as coral bleaching, where they're dying out. And we're seeing all these other ecological, behavior, and physiological changes happening in animal populations around the world, right? Altered migrations, earlier breeding, changes in sex ratios related to temperature. Numerous effects are occurring worldwide in different populations and different ecosystems. So that's all that is currently happening right now, right? With that 1 degree of warming that we've experienced so far since 1990 or 1900s about. Now we're going to project into the future. So before we look at future climate effects, I want to briefly touch and talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They were established in 1988 by 2 UN programs, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program. So they don't actually conduct research, but they compile and assess research done by hundreds of scientists around the world. And they present that research in a series of assessment reports. The most recent one just came out. And if you go to this link here, I encourage you to go to it. Where's my pointer? I encourage you to go to it. You can read the most recent assessment report that they just released. You can read the full report. They also put out summaries that are shorter. So kind of like I talked about, their mission is to provide comprehensive scientific assessments of the current scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information worldwide about the risk of climate change caused by human activity, its potential effects, and options for adapting to those effects, right, or mitigating their effects. So if we're looking about future effects, we often rely on climate models, which are computer programs that simulate weather patterns over time. Now, they're used to predict how the climate might change in the future. And if you want to read more about climate models, I would encourage you to go to this link. It has more information about how they work essentially, and the different types of models. For this course, why I'm bringing it up is because I want you to be aware of what they are and to know that the IPCC has produced a set of 4 representative concentrative pathways that are based on these numerous models that are developed. And these 4 pathways represent likely scenarios of what will occur based on our rate of emissions, right? Now, at a You can see them all over here, right? In RPC, these four scenarios, they RPC 8.5, which is if we have no effort to curtail emissions, and these number values are related to that radiative forcing, which we looked at briefly talked about in the previous lecture. For us, just think of it as the amount of warming that could occur, right? So with no effort to curtail more emissions, RCP 8.5, it tracks what we think are concentrations of carbon dioxide will get up to in the atmosphere. By 2100, this level right here is what hasn't been seen since an extremely warm period, that Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, where there were alligators in the Arctic, right, at this concentration. So not necessarily to say that that's what happened, but kind of scary to think about. We have scenarios where we have some effort to curtail emissions, right? RCP 6.0 and RCP 4.5. And then we have where we give a great effort to curtail emissions, RCP 2.6, right? And you can see where we predict CO2 concentrations to be under these various scenarios. And besides just CO2 concentrations, we predict what global temperatures or the increase in global temperature will be based on them, right? Now, as you see, as we get out further, we have more uncertainty, right? That's what the width of these is. Pretty close in the next couple years, we have a pretty good idea of what we think the temperatures would be based on where we are in these models and our emissions. But as we go out further, we are less certain, right? But nevertheless, these pathways provide us a guideline of where we would expect concentrations of CO2 to be, temperatures to be, and consequently environmental effects and human effects based on the future of climate change. So let's look at them now, right? Here's just another another figure that looks at these different scenarios and what we would expect different concentrations to be, right? Just more information for you guys. As you can see in that RCP 2.6, that is where we're expecting to actually lower our emissions and get below what we have historically been emitting. We'll see if we get there, right? So if we're looking at future climate effects, we are going to see a continued increase in mean global temperature, right? That's going to happen no matter what. We can't stop that right now. But we can limit the amount of increase that we're going to see. Now, the best scenario is to keep warming under 2 degrees Celsius. That's what we're trying to do. And really, ideally, we want to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to what the temperatures were in 1900. Whether we can do that, we are going to see. But if you look here, based on these different RCP scenarios, we have different potential temperatures that we can expect to be at when we get to 2100, right? So at the lowest scenario, we would be probably around 1.6 degrees, maybe up to 2 degrees, right? This is with the percentage confidence that we would get to 1 degree warming, 1.5 degree warming, 2 degrees, etc., right? But essentially, to take away from this, right, we can just kind of look at these numbers right here. On average, with the scenario where we do our best to curtail emissions, we're going to see a change in 1.6 degrees relative to that 1900 temperature. If we don't do anything, we're going to see about a 4.3 degree increase in global temperatures, which would have drastic consequences. And down here, you can see, oh, that should be 2.6. But you can see global temperature change around the Earth based on these two scenarios, right? So you can see with that scenario where we're really not curtailing emissions, you see emissions. You see, I keep saying emotions. You see a much greater increase in temperature, or at least potential increase in temperature as well. So just like we're already seeing, global precipitation is going to increase. Now it's not going to be equally distributed. Generally, our wet places will get wetter, our dry places will get drier, and you can see the difference, right? Again, with this between these two extremes where we're trying to curtail emissions and where we're not at all, you see the effect, and the effect is always going to be greater where we're not doing anything. We're not trying to curtail those emissions. We're going to have more warming and more environmental effects and greater intensity of storms and extreme weather. We're already seeing that, right? If we look at currently, um, we have seen an increase in billion-dollar disaster event frequency over the past couple of years. The past most recent years have seen more than in previous years before. And we're expecting this to only increase as we go further into the future with climate change. We see a loss of sea ice in all models, right? So no matter what we do, we're going to continue to see a loss of sea ice. But in the worst model, we'll call it, right? The model where we're not doing anything to curtail emissions, we see that the Arctic will become completely ice-free in the summertime with that model, for following along that model. We're going to see less snow in the northern hemisphere, and we're going to see a continued loss of permafrost. Even in the best model where we're curtailing emissions, we're still going to see a loss of about 37% of permafrost, but we can see up to about 81% loss in that 8.5 model. Again, this is going to have effects on species, populations, etc. Ocean acidification is only going to increase. So what's happening with ocean acidification is that CO2 that is being emitted gets absorbed by the ocean and gets converted to carbonic acid, which lowers the pH slightly of the oceans. When that pH lowers, it reduces the availability of calcium carbonate. Now, many species use calcium carbonate for their shells, right? We kind of talked about that when we looked at the foraminifera in the previous lecture. But coral, oysters, clams all use calcium carbonate to make their shells. Without that, they are at increased risk of essentially dying, right? And you can see under these different scenarios, you can think of these as the different emission scenarios. You see the negative effect on these species drastically increases the more or the less we do to curtail emissions. And going right along with that, we're going to see a continued loss of other species, right? We already have seen that currently about 11,000 species are impacted by climate change, and that's only going to increase, and those impacts are only going to get worse in the future, right? For species to adapt to this changing climate, they can migrate to other zones that are more habitable to their conditions that they need for their survival. But they need to move faster than about 1,000 meters per year, which many of them aren't going to be able to keep up with, right? And that's going to lead to their extinction. And you can see, again, I keep kind of hammering this point home, but under these different emission scenarios, the risk is different, right? So if at that 2.6 where we're doing something about emissions, the risk to these species is less than under where we're in a scenario where we're not doing anything, and we're going to see much more drastic effects. I talked about sea level rise already, that it's occurring. Well, by 2100, we can expect a foot of rise if we can keep our warming to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. But if we can't, we can expect up to about 6.6 feet, which is huge, right? And again, we can kind of see that illustrated here based on these different scenarios. And in New Jersey, specific to where we are, even if we hold global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, New Jersey is likely to experience sea level rise of 1.3 to 2.7 feet by 2070 and up to 4 feet by 2100, right? Even if we can meet that target of 2 degrees, which we aren't really on track right now, we're still going to see potentially 4 feet of sea level rise along our coasts. And if we take no action, New Jersey could see sea level rise of 1.5 to 3.5 feet by 2070 and 2.3 to 6.3 feet by 2100. A huge increase in sea level. It would drastically impact all of our coastal communities. So a lot of effects, right? A lot of current effects. Really, the future effects are just exaggerations or increases on those current effects that we're already seeing. So how do we respond to this, right? We've seen these potentially existential threats, right, that are going to impact our very existence on this planet. How do we respond to them? Well, there's three main categories: mitigation, adaptation, and geoengineering. Mitigation refers to actions aimed at limiting the magnitude of climate change, particularly dealing with emissions right now, or greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation refers to actions aimed at minimizing the impact of climate change, right? And geoengineering is this large scale manipulation of environmental processes to try and counteract climate change. So, if we're talking about each of these, really the ideal one is mitigation, right? And you can see it in these flow diagrams, right? The more mitigation that you have now, the less greenhouse gases are going to be emitted, the less serious climate change effects, fewer impacts on human and environment, and less adaptation is required later. Makes sense, right? If you do the opposite and you have less mitigation now, you're going to have more greenhouse gases, more serious effects, greater impacts, and you're going to require more adaptation. So, really, we should be focusing right now on this mitigation. So, how do we mitigate for climate change? Well, a lot of it comes down to policy work, right? We can look at global policy, we can look at federal policy in the US, and then we can look at regional policy that we have in New Jersey. So, we'll start at the global stage, right? We are a part of the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, this was an international agreement between 195 countries with the aim of keeping global warming between 2 degrees and ideally between 1.5. They're really shooting for that 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as a part of this, all the countries, or the major emitting countries, committed to reducing their emissions. The US committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below its 2005 level by 2025, and to make best efforts to reduce its emissions by 28%, right? So to try and get to that 28%. This Paris Climate Agreement also provides a pathway for developed nations to assist developing nations in their climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. This goes a little bit to climate justice, which I don't get into in this lecture. But really, for a lot of environmental things, what you'll find is that the main contributors bear less of a burden, or less of a burden of the greater effects, right? So a lot of the developed nations have done a lot of emissions. They've done a lot to pollute, right? Especially greenhouse gases. And now the effects are going to be felt. They will be felt in these developed nations as well, but they're particularly going to be felt in a lot of developing nations that don't have the resources to combat the effects of climate change, right? So there needs to be pathways for these developing nations to or assistance. There should be assistance to these developing nations to deal with these things that many of them aren't as responsible for contributing to as some other developed nations. So that's kind of that pathway that has worked into this Paris Climate Agreement. So this was adopted in 2015. The US legally joined it in 2016 by an executive order from President Obama. President Trump did pull us out of it in November 2020, but President Biden rejoined the agreement in February 2021. So how are we doing? There is a great website, Climate Action Tracker. It's climateactiontracker.org, that keeps track of how the world and individual countries are doing based on their commitments to the Paris Climate Agreement. You can see here, if we're looking at our policies and real world action right here, we are above our goal, right? Our goal was to be at 2 degrees, really 1.5 degrees. We're projected right now, based on our real world stuff, to reach about 2.7 degrees all the way up to 3.6, right? So we're not doing great. Countries have set 2030 targets, and if they reach those 2030 targets, it would lead us only to about a 2.4 degree increase, still not at our goal. If we are able to get our 2030 targets and some long-term targets that we've set so far, we can get about to 2.1, which is getting better. And if we're really optimistic, if we have the best case scenario, we can be at 1.8. But really, right now, we are not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 or even 2 degrees. How's the U.S. doing? Well, the U.S. is not meeting our goals, not exactly, although we're getting better, right? Part of that is because um, President Trump reversed over 100 environmental rules. He pulled us out of this. We've had a reversal now with the Biden administration, and they've set the goal to decarbonize the power sector by 2035. The infrastructure bill that was recently passed allocates about 65 billion for clean energy and grid-related investments. And the Build Back Better Act, which is stalled right now, it passed in the House, but it's not in the Senate, that designates $555 billion to aggressively combat climate change and cut greenhouse gas emissions. We'll see if that ultimately gets passed. So if we're talking about U.S. federal policy, we don't have any comprehensive climate change or carbon policy. The last time that was attempted was back in 2009 by President Obama, who tried to implement some sort of carbon pricing. And this carbon pricing, we've already seen an example of it, or an example of what would be carbon pricing with that cap and trade system that we saw with sulfur dioxide, right? That was so effective. But besides just a cap and trade system, you could also implement a carbon tax, which would directly set a price per ton of emissions, right? So if you were going to emit, there's going to be this tax that is levied against you. And again, that cap and trade, you guys looked at that where we're really setting the total amount of emissions, and then it's up to you to figure out how to meet that. So we have had multiple attempts of trying to get some sort of climate change policy or federal policy implemented. It hasn't been successful yet. Instead, we've kind of been working a little bit more piecemeal, right? We set regulations on fuel emissions. We put money towards energy and infrastructure and making that more efficient. But we haven't had this large scale comprehensive policy on the federal level. Now, on the regional level, we are a part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So, this is a cap and trade system that exists between us and a number of other states: Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Virginia. So, this is a regional greenhouse gas cap and trade system that we are a part of. There are other cap and trade systems. California has their own separate one as well. So this was started in 2005 and took effect in 2009. Now, Chris Christie removed New Jersey from the initiative in 2012, but we did rejoin it recently in 2020, right? And you can see it's just like the sulfur dioxide cap and trade that I had you guys read about. It has been effective in reducing emissions, right? These are the emissions, and this is the cap that we have that has been set along this, right? And so this is the cap. This is the total amount of emissions that can be produced, and it's up to markets and these states to figure out how to reach that through by any means possible, right? It's been effective so far. So how do we actually do that, right? We set these policy goals of reducing emissions. How do we actually go about doing it? Well, if you think about the emitters, like the big emitters, it comes from the burning of fossil fuels that we talked about, right? And most of that is occurring through power generation or transportation, right? So there's a number of ways we can alter how we produce power to reduce our emissions, right? We can go from traditional or conventional energy, right, burning of fossil fuels, to renewable energy. And we're going to have separate lectures on energy, so I won't get too in depth into this, but right. But we could go towards wind or solar, even nuclear power, right? Much less emissions than fossil fuels. Going from coal to natural gas is much better for fossil fuels for reducing emissions. Biofuels, and then even carbon capture systems, which we'll look at the end of this, being applied to fossil fuel plants, particularly coal plants. However, that carbon capture is still very expensive, which is limiting that. So we can shift how we produce power to make it more environmentally friendly. We can also do some other things, right? We can improve our vehicle fuel efficiency, right? Get better fuel efficiency in our vehicles. We can increase electric vehicle production, right? There is a little bit of um, even when you're driving an electric vehicle, the vehicle's not producing emissions, but you need electricity, and that electricity is producing emissions. They've done studies, so even if you're getting your electricity produced through you know, burning of fossil fuels, having an electric vehicle still produces less emissions than a conventional vehicle. So it's another way. And wherever you live, as that increase in renewables or energy production that isn't producing carbon dioxide emissions increases, your the effect of that electric vehicle on decreasing emissions increases as well, right? So increased vehicle fuel efficiency, switch to electric, improve the energy efficiency of buildings, right? Energy efficient lights, appliances, etc., right? Anything to cut down on needing to use energy. You can also promote reforestation, right? Forests are carbon sinks, many of them, right? And there are many trees that are carbon sinks, so they take in more carbon than they expel. They have done studies where they're trying to highlight the best trees in the U.S. That are most effective in taking in carbon, and those are some of them listed right there. The common horse chestnut, black walnuts we have here, sweet gums we have here, ponderosa pine, red pine, white pine is commonly planted, even though it's not native to here. Douglas fir, scarlet oak, have them, red oaks, etc., are some of the best trees to plant to capture carbon. But what can you do, right? What can you do as an individual to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the potential effects of climate change going forward? Well, you can take personal steps, right? You can try and reduce your personal carbon footprint, travel less, carpool, buy local produce for the most part, right? Sometimes it's not always the best thing to do, right, in terms of carbon emissions. Plant trees, like we talked about, volunteer with environmental restoration groups that are trying to reforest or create more natural habitats. But really, you can also talk with your wallet, right? There are climate neutral certified brands. The link is right here. You can also just Google this, right? That are brands that are certified that they are carbon neutral, right? So in their production, or at least working towards it. So buy those brands, right? Support those brands. As I already talked about, make your home energy efficient. Try and buy those energy efficient products to cut down your consumption of electricity. And really, what is maybe most important is use your vote, right? This is a global problem, right? And it is bigger than just what any one person can do. So it's going to take these big policy initiatives in order to have a real effect, right? And we're seeing it even if we're not. It doesn't mean that it's ultimately the president that is going to dictate everything, right? We are seeing this on a more regional level. I can go back with this regional greenhouse gas initiative, right? So this isn't, even though at this time we couldn't get a federal response, these are governors coming together and state legislators coming together. So it's really important that you vote. And this is, if this is really important to you, which it should be, right? When you just looked at all those effects, it's important that who you vote for takes climate change seriously and has a plan to address it, right? So it's probably most important out of all of this is use your vote, really on all levels. Use your vote from president down to local administration. Make sure that this is a part of their agenda. So that's mitigation, right? Ways that we can reduce emissions. And that's really the best thing we can do because it's going to decrease the negative effects that we're going to see. Now, if we can't stop those effects, we have to adapt to them. And that's where this comes into play, right? Now, there's a number of ways that we can adapt to a changing climate, right? We're going to want to improve our infrastructure, right? Through sewers and culverts and levees, have them better prepared for the changes that we are expecting, right? Wherever we are. And particularly in us, it's going to be related to coastal resiliency, which we'll look at. We need to improve our residential and health programs, right? And this is worldwide. We need to improve access to clean water, more resilience to extreme weather, cooling centers, and areas that, in developing areas, poor areas where there's not air conditioning, right? And it can get super hot. We need cooling centers to cool people off, even in our own cities, and improved air quality. Tackling disease and disease vectors. We're expecting that there's going to be with that warming, potential new diseases that we're going to be exposed to, or vectors that are going to be able to travel to areas that they haven't been before. So we need to be able to have a good response to disease and disease vectors. Shifting agriculture is important. We won't get too deep into that, but there are agricultural practices that we can do, conservation agriculture, no-till agriculture, that are more environmental friendly, take less water, use less energy, that would go a long way toward improving our adaptive capacity. Improve institutional capacity, right? So our emergency and our business community planning for this, and improve our water storage infrastructure. All ways that we can adapt to a changing climate. Specific to New Jersey, a big important thing that we need to recognize is to improve our coastal resiliency. Right? We are a coastal state. We've already seen that sea level is rising. It's going to continue to rise, and we need to be able to adapt to that, right? One of the best ways is to utilize natural ecosystem services. So create or protect dunes. They have a great effect of naturally protecting homes and infrastructure from large storms. If you look at Hurricane Sandy, the places that fared best were the places that had a nice established dune system. Protect your wetlands. They serve a similar function, right? And protecting infrastructure behind them. Adopt living shorelines instead of harder structures. So living shorelines are a method where you're trying to stabilize your shoreline, right? Instead of putting in a bulkhead or a hard structure, and it comes with all these negative effects, you use natural structures such as oyster reefs or creating wetlands to improve resiliency in that way. It's a much more environmentally friendly way, and it has more better positive effects than just putting in hard structures. And preserve your coastal open space. New Jersey has a Blue Acres program where they provide funding for local municipalities to purchase coastal areas and keep them open like that to improve resiliency. And where possible, retreat, right? People like to live on the shore. I get it. You like to live, have that nice ocean view, but it's not going to last in many areas. It is a dynamic area. Sea level is rising. So where you can, where retreat is possible, move homes backward. Don't build right along the shore. People, not everyone is going to follow that, but those are all ways to improve resiliency. The last thing we're going to talk about is geoengineering, right? So we looked at mitigation, which is our best solution, adaptation. So mitigation, we're reducing greenhouse gases. Adaptation, we are adapting to the changing or to the effects of climate change. Now, geoengineering is this kind of interesting techniques that we're going to use to actively counter the warming that's occurring. And some of it sounds like science fiction, right? So just some examples. We can inject aerosols, particularly sulfur, into the stratosphere, and that will form these aerosols are essentially cloud cover that will then reflect solar radiation back into space. You see it right here. Where's my pointer? You can see it right here. Right? So we're actively injecting the sulfur. Now, this is achievable today, and it's actually relatively inexpensive. A wealthy individual could pull this off. However, there's the potential side effects of this, right? The health and ecosystem effects. We're injecting sulfur. We talked about sulfur dioxide, right? And the effect that has on human health and on and with acid rain formation. That's essentially what we'd be forming. We don't know how that would ultimately affect health and ecosystem effects. So it's possible, a little bit scary. Other geoengineering solutions a space sunshade. This is actually theoretically pretty possible. We can launch a thin shade into the orbit, so out into space, to block out sunlight before it can reach the planet. Like I said, it's largely achievable with present technology, although potentially very expensive. And again, similar issues, right? We're going to deprive light from impacting the Earth. We don't know ultimately the ramifications of this. And that's with a lot of these geoengineering solutions. They're neat, they seem futuristic, but they could have potentially large consequences as well. We can add iron to the ocean. So most ocean environments are limited by iron availability. If we add iron to the ocean surface, it enables the growth of phytoplankton. They will absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and then they're going to die and sink to the bottom of the ocean, and that CO2 will be sequestered or kept at the bottom of the ocean. Again, another possibility, don't know, could have potentially large side effects. And lastly, we have carbon capture. So this is where we're actually taking CO2 out of the air, right? And there are a number of methods and different variations of this. The problem with this right now is that it's very expensive, right? And it's difficult to scale up. So it's being done on a small scale, but to scale this up to really take in a lot of carbon, it is too cost prohibitive now. But this does seem like a potential solution to aid in reducing CO2 levels in the future. So that is it for climate change. I hope you guys saw, maybe not are scared of this, but saw the importance of climate change, the effects that we're seeing now, the effects that we'll see in the future, and really the how bad those effects could be based on what we do right now, right? So that is it. I will see you guys next week.